Hello everyone and welcome to our series of webinars hosted here in our virtual 67 Pall Mall. Later we will be with our own Federico Mocchia, who will be looking at islands around the world where wine is grown. And then myself and Sophie will be running the 67 Big Wine Quiz. And finally today we'll be joined by Carl McCoy, MS, the CEO of Height Cellars in Napa Valley. And for now, we're really pleased to welcome an old friend of the club, Mr. Peter Gago, the chief winemaker at Penfolds, who is speaking with Richard Hemming, MW, from the McGill Estate in South Australia. So please do chat away on the side, tell us what you're drinking and where you're drinking it from. And also please take a photo and share it on social media with hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end where you can ask Peter any questions you wish to. Please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box at the side. So we hope you have a nice glass of Penfolds at hand, and a big welcome to Peter and Richard.
Thanks very much, Ronan. It's a pleasure to be here again, coming to you from Singapore. We've been joined by lots of attendees, and I know that many of you have got the tasting pack of these 6 Penfolds must-have wines in front of you. I'd encourage you all, please, to start tasting straight away. We are going to talk about the wines throughout this presentation, but we're also going to have a little chat about the story of Penfolds and Peter's role. Now, Peter and I have met several times. I'm very fortunate to have been to McGill Estate and had a great vertical of Grange. I've tasted the range with him in London several times, and I've been tasting these wines tonight. I think they're looking fantastic. So it's sure to be a really insightful and enjoyable evening. Just a quick reminder, please do let us know what you're drinking with the chat box, and if you do have any questions, put them in the Q&A and I will make sure that we get to them 15 minutes before this hour elapses. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, Peter, if you could tell us what has changed in the style of these must-have wines since you've been the chief winemaker at Penfolds since 2002.
Well, Richard, great to be here firstly, and quite a few things have changed in recent years. As we know, nothing stands still. I've been with Penfolds since 1989, but I've worked with people who have been there a lot longer. We have a great team of people who go back even further than myself, and I'm now, over 3 decades at Penfolds. Do we change styles? No, we alter and refine stylistic templates. And every now and then we create a new wine, but it's not about making, for example, a better Grange by changing the way we make it or changing the oak type or whatever. It's a little bit more subtle than that. It's about the pressing regime, the vineyard assessments. It's all the 1%ers all the way through the process. So have things changed? Yes, subtly, incrementally. It's about an emphasis on tannin, texture, structure. It's, I guess, because we are Penfolds, we're looking at that propensity to age. How do we get white wines to tighten up and go the same distance that the red wines go, for example? I think a lot of that has changed in recent times. You know, we're going to start tonight with Yattarna, and the first few Yattarnas, as an example, we were trying to do everything with this style. We're trying to put it all into the one glass, into the one bottle. Everything we'd seen with the great white Burgundies of the world, we wanted to do with this wine. And we're actually trying too hard. In effect, the analogy could be with music. We were overproducing, trying too hard. Now it's a lot simpler. And they're tricks, techniques you learn on the way. So now it's all about fruit selection. It's all about the pressing. It's all about the barrel select. So yes, changes, but more refinements, I guess you could say, Richard.
Well, I mean, Chardonnay, of course, in Australia has gone through several sort of evolutions of style in the time that I've been working in the wine trade. When I started, the popular style was more heavily oaked than you would expect to find these days, probably with more malolactic butteriness and with much less of the kind of reductive matchstick sort of character that then became very fashionable, and which now seems to have swung back the other way. So we're moving away from those very lean styles of Chardonnay, which were perhaps too reductive, and into a really comfortable middle ground. And that's something I get off this Yatana. There's a really lovely balance of, you know, the appropriate, well-integrated oak spice, touch of flintiness, really pure fruit. It's delicious.
Absolutely, you know, and we're not tied to, when I use the term stylistic template, it's not a formula. If we go back to, say, the 1997 Yatana, we used 100% new oak. Every French barrique we could find, we used new. You went to other vintages that had no new oak. This one is roughly 1 barrique and 2, about 50% new oak. So a lot depends on the year, a lot depends upon the barrel selection to create something that isn't overtly oaky. Oak's a big part of the style. Obviously, it contains the lees, that volume to surface area is very important. Batonnage is very important, and in some years there's more or less depending upon the vintage. But to that point, that the search for this one is really to get that grip, to get that definition, and as earlier mentioned, to allow people to have the choice to drink it upon release, or maybe 20 years later, or any time across that period. And I think it's a fairly noble pursuit. Yatana, we have its younger brother, its younger sister, the Reserve Bin, and that still has some of those characters you refer to, the cordite, the struck match, the more reductive characters, albeit a little bit toned down to some of the older Reserve Bins. But nevertheless, 2 completely different styles of Chardonnay. You know, Reserve Bin, a little bit of natural ferment, not much filtration. This quite pristine, very managed all the way through. So if we're talk about intervention, we do intervene here, less so with the Reserve Bin Chardonnay. So it's horses for courses when it comes to making Chardonnay. And Kim Schroeder, who is our white winemaker, who's been with the group now for, oh goodness me, 3.5 decades. It's all about the fruit, the vineyards, and in this instance, we're looking at Tasmania predominantly, but not exclusively. The Yatana will use fruit from the Adelaide Hills, southern Victoria, and quite often, but not always, the Snowy Mountains, Tumbarumba. So we have a lot of different colours to paint this picture called Yatana.
And when you were talking just before about ageability, and you mentioned some of the variables that you have, such as batonnage and oak usage, for example, what qualities and what winemaking decisions can you make that will improve the ageability of a wine such as Yatana?
Well, I think it all gets, again, back down to the fruit and balance, obviously. The right pH, the right natural acidity, having oak there, not to prop up the wine, but to frame the wine. The use of batonnage, you know, how much flesh, how much character, how many artifacty type hybrid characters surrounding the wine do you want? You don't want to mask the fruit, but then you don't want to just be drinking a Chardonnay flavored white wine. And I think the analogy I've been using over the years is, as with our red wines, we want layers of complexity. We want depth of flavor, but not any one character overriding the others. And I think, yeah, with very gentle pressing, as you would do in Champagne, with the retention of varied amounts of solids from the press through the process, you know, every barrique is filled directly from the press, not via a buffer tank. So no 2 barriques are the same. So because of that varying amount of solids in the barrique, when the whole thing starts fermenting in barrel, you end up with oftentimes scores and scores and scores of different fermentations. And, you know, rather than use fruit off different vineyards or different soil types, we're using the same material of the same vineyard, but from a different fermenter, a la a different barrique. So you can really intervene a little bit in that regard, you know, and the wine is blended. At the end of all of this, those barriques are put together and the blend is created. And yeah, Yatana. And let's not forget too, the word Yatana, an indigenous word meaning little by little or gradually. And this project hasn't ended. It started with the 95 vintage released in 1998. And here we are with the 2017 vintage. We've just finished our 2020 harvest. And that Yatana will be different again to this, albeit though of this style. So if anything, as a direction, we've tightened up the style, we've given it more clarity, more definition, and I'd like to think a little bit more interest as well. You know, they can't just be sort of a mono-charactered Chardonnay. We want all of those complexities, but not by trying too hard.
Now, talking of the 2020 vintage, have you experienced any shortages of fruit because of smoke taint in regions such as, for example, Tumbarumba or anywhere else?
Yeah, well, look, we've selfishly been very lucky at Penfolds with our own vineyards, but obviously a lot of our growers have been significantly impacted by those earlier fires. Smoke taint, not so much here in South Australia, predominantly, you know, Adelaide Hills, yes, but Tumbarumba very badly affected. And this is another reason why, too, we're very fortunate with the Etana style. It's almost, I used to joke, you know, our fruit selection from different vineyards is almost a climate control mechanism. And we've been using it for a century and a half before the word or expression climate change existed. In a warm year, we simply went south down Coonawarra Way Road, Rattenbury Pathway for reds. In a cool year, we'd go up a bit further north, Clare, McLaren Vale, Barossa, to create these styles. So a bit climate change in that regard. With the smoke problem, though, that's been recently found out with the 2020 vintage, yes, obviously we don't go anywhere near that smoke-affected fruit. We test for everything. Sometimes it's easy to miss, but fortunately, we have been very lucky. But overall, in 2020, we've publicly stated already, volumes are down, yields are down, so there are issues, but no two harvests are the same. You know, in the year 2000, millennium vintage, we made, for example, what would it have been? Less than 1/4 of the average volume of grain to get the quality. 2011, another difficult vintage, less than half of the volume to get that quality. 2020, Shiraz yields are down. We'll make less at that top end, perhaps. And that's what agriculture is all about. That's what vintage variation is all about. And in many ways, you've got to look not just at the last harvest, but the last 10 to see what your real success and hit rate is. But we're very pleased this vintage in 2020 with the quality of Riesling, for example, as good as we've seen. Even though many vineyards were affected in the Adelaide Hills, we've got some great material out of Piccadilly. Shiraz is looking terrific, albeit with reduced yields. So, you know, that's agriculture.
And talking of different vintages, I can see on the chat, we've got somebody who's got a 2002 Etana open. Somebody mentioned having a 2006 a couple of weeks ago. So that's fantastic. Great to hear that people are enjoying these older vintages. Now, we do have a few photos and slides and some information about the wine. So we've jumped right into the tastings here, but I wanted to just go through some of these pictures, Peter, because they are fantastic and not everybody will necessarily have seen them before. So this is McGill Estate where you are now, and
yeah,
it's
but not with
by the kind of conurbation of Adelaide.
Indeed, indeed. So this winery was established in 1844, 176 years back. And nowadays you can see it's encapsulated, it's surrounded by suburbia in effect. But back in the days, the mid-1800s, this was all farmland. All of the hills that you can see behind the winery were covered in Penfold vineyards. Suburbia has encroached. We have many, many, many more vineyards now than we ever did back in the 1800s. But it was so good that we've retained this site, and more importantly, the vineyard, and it still is a working winery, 14, 15 minutes out of a city centre. So we get many people who travel to McGill literally straight off an aeroplane, well, not at the moment, Adelaide Airport, and within, you know, half an hour of arrival in the country, they're at McGill Estate, here in this tasting room, or in the restaurant, or in our brasserie cafe, what we call the kitchen. So we're very proud of the spiritual home of Penfolds. And for those who haven't visited it, it's a must visit if you get to South Australia.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, it's got such a great atmosphere, and they're such historic buildings. You know, it's like visiting any sort of great historical estate. When you actually go there and see the place yourself and taste the wines in situ, you get such a better understanding and appreciation of how the wines are made. Now, you mentioned the early days, so that looks like a picture perhaps of McGill Estate when there was no Adelaide surrounding it.
Yes, yes. You can see the vineyard that still exists out the front. We make a single vineyard McGill Estate Shiraz from that fruit. The vines, though, have been replanted over the years. On one side, the vines would only be, 65 years of age. But the little insert below, the horse and cart days, and there's so much history here. If you go, and maybe even in the next slide, you go underground, you'll see the original bins when they were made, again, with pick and shovel. And they are, in effect, vaults or compartments where we stored wine pre-release. We'd bottle and then we'd bin them. They would be stored in different numbered vaults or bins beneath this winery. Remembering that South Australia then is like it is now, a very warm place in summer. And of course, we bottle and don't release the next day. We store these wines for bottle maturation, up to 4 or 5 years before sale.
Fantastic. And here's another old picture. I couldn't quite work out what we were looking at here. Is this a cellar being dug out?
Yeah, that quite often to get to the stage where they can start tunneling into the hill, they have to almost quarry out the bit in front. And as you can see, it's literally pick and shovel, horse and cart, removing megatons of earth. This doesn't do the incline of the hill behind justice, because it's a lot steeper than that. And literally the tunnels, the bins go right into the hill. So remember, before refrigeration, before air conditioning, before jackhammers, before anything, this is how it was done at McGill.
That's amazing. And thank goodness for them setting all of that up to start the legacy. Now, here's a kind of overview of the Penfolds range. And as you can see, we've got a kind of the single vineyard range, the single region range, and then the multi-region range, of which Grange is rightly the best known. And it struck me when I was looking at this earlier that that is the Burgundy system in reverse.
Indeed.
And of course, Grange is famous for being a selection of the most brilliant Shiraz that you can find, and which is blended together to represent Australian Shiraz, generally speaking. And in terms of these three different categories, are they thought of as sort of an improvement in quality, or is it more that they're different?
I think to that question, it's very much a matter of choice. It is a matter of diversity. I guess if it were still Penfolds, the McGill Estate Winery, with a vineyard or two around it, every second sentence of mine would contain the word terroir. I'd be talking about nothing other than sense of place. And that's what we do with the first category of wines, the single vineyard wines. I can't spell terroir, but I think I can pronounce it. And, when we turned 170 years of age, people were expecting a lovely blend to be created to celebrate that 170 years. But you can see at the bottom there, bin 170 Kalimna Shiraz was exclusively not even off a single vineyard, off a single block. And it was about twice the price of Grange. So price, quality, and positioning within those three styles of wine is really just by coincidence more than anything. I guess, though, the wine collector, the connoisseur, the market determines which of these wines will be more favoured. But even McGill Estate Shiraz, which is in the first category of single vineyards, McGill Estate Shiraz is a monopole of Penfolds, single vineyard, single owner, yet it is still a blend. We have 3 blocks here at McGill. We ferment across a number of days. We pick across a couple of days into any one of 8 fermenters. And we'll relegate 1 or 2, we'll elevate 1 sometimes into Grange even, it doesn't much matter, and then we blend the remaining components. So McGill, respecting the terroir of this site where I'm sitting now and the soils of it, is still a blend from the 3 blocks. But the philosophy of that blending is very little different to St Honore or Grange, where we just use synergy structurally in a flavour sense to create something altogether different. It's lovely now we're making a champagne as well, or 3 champagnes. This is almost the blending process in that third category of what is used in champagne. using 1, 2 or 3 varieties. In the instance of champagne, well, we'll use as many varieties as we wish across vineyards. So it's just a blending synergy, a different approach. The middle category, of course, from single regions. You make many wines. Coonawarra Bin 128, can only come from Coonawarra, can only be stored in French oak. Whereas something like Bin 138 can only come from the Barossa Valley. So it's a lovely thing to have that lovely portfolio of wine which has been put together over 1 3/4 centuries. It is very complicated. We have a great winemaking team with responsibilities for different vineyards and different styles to create this portfolio, which sounds a little bit odd, but it is a portfolio of wine. It would be lovely just to make 1, 2 or 3. It gets very complicated logistically to come up, and there are only a few examples of each of those 3 styles.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on and look at some of the different regions from which your grapes are sourced. So we're all the way down in Tasmania here. And
yes.
Can you tell just from looking what variety we've got there?
Yeah, that is Chardonnay, and I know the vineyard, and that's the Derwent there in front of it. And in the Tasmanian setup, in Australia, it's a very warm place, and we often talk about cool climate Chardonnay fruit selection. You think, hang on, cool climate Australia? Well, we achieve cool climate fruit selection by either going up in altitude or down in latitude. Tasmania, you go any further south, you bump into this landmass that's oftentimes covered with snow called Antarctica. You can't go much further south than this. But it's an interesting shot, that one you're looking at, because you're basically at river level, at sea level. And we're getting great quality fruit at that elevation. The highest vineyard we have access to in Tasmania with some of the best fruit is at 190 metres. So again, using the term climate change, whatever, if things do get warmer, we just go up the mountain, up the hill a little bit further. In Tumbarumba, I think there's a slide coming up for it in a moment, we go up into the snowy mountains, within view almost of Australia's tallest peak, Mount Kosciuszko. So we achieve marginality that way. We often use, again, another champagne analogy that was used years ago. You go, a few K up the road and the grapes don't physiologically ripen. Well, with elevation, you go another 100 metres up and maybe they don't ripen. And what we find is that fruit that's just on that cusp of physiological ripeness gives us exactly what we want. That tightness, that definition, that linearity, that character that you really can't get with Chardonnay from warmer climates.
Sure. And talking of cooler climates, here we are up in the Adelaide Hills. A very pretty vineyard shot there.
Yeah, and that's I'm here at McGill, so the Adelaide Hills are just on the other side of the hill to the east of where I'm currently sitting. And we tend to get fruit from the Adelaide Hills from vineyards that are usually in excess of 350 metres. And Pinot Noir from up there as well. There's one vineyard up there that goes up to 625 metres with the MB6 clone for Pinot Noir. So again, using, metres above sea level to get that character in the Chardonnay fruit.
And then you mentioned this fantastic shot of a snow-covered vineyard in Tumbarumba in New South Wales. And, I think if you showed that picture to anybody and said, which country is that? They'd say Austria or Germany, and not many people would associate that with Australia. No. And not to forget, this was the area that had the bushfires only just recently. So we talk about, climatic shift and variation and extremes. I think that's what the whole world is coming up against currently. We've had fires in Spain, in Greece, 2017, massive fires across California. It's not just Australia. So, with having vineyards in many different disparate geographical districts, we're sort of ensuring ourselves, I guess. It's sad to say, but that's the reality. But yes, that's fairly cool climate, I guess you could say. Tumbarumba. And then we've already talked a bit about the Yutana, but carrying on that cool climate theme, and referencing back to my question at the beginning when I said what has changed over the years, I would imagine that over the last 20 or 30 years or so, the fruit that's going into the Yatana is probably coming from cooler and cooler regions. Would you be making that decision at the point of picking and allocating those grapes to Yatana? Or is there a tasting done, as you said, barrel by barrel, and it just so happens that cooler regions have become the preferred style for Yatana Chardonnay?
Yeah, look, I guess too, you know, there are many contenders to begin with, and then as you go through the fermentation process, you know, you get conically less and less to choose from. But a lot of the vineyards in cooler climates have a very good track record now. We have, for example, what we call a Grange Club, but it's called really a Grange Yatana Growers Club. So to be members of that club, they have to have had fruit go into these styles over a period of time. So we know what to look for, but once the fruit is picked and pressed and then barrel fermenting, every barrique stands on its own legs in terms of nothing's preordained. So like with Grange, you know, we make our selection, and I'll be starting on Monday of next week with the winemaking team. We have 2 full weeks of classification tastings. Harvest is now complete. All of the reds have gone through malolactic fermentation. They're all ready to be assessed. We make that assessment for Grange and some of the blends. We don't, the single vineyard wines, of course, but we do so organoleptically blind. We don't know for Grange, for example, with the vineyard, the variety or the volume. It takes all of the biases out of the selection. And pretty much the same with Yatana. You have contenders, you have the ferments, and you have what's on the bench, and then you have the final volume of what's selected. And if you can do it honestly and blind-like, and we're not saying this is the way to make wine, by the way, but it's a technique we use very effectively for red and white wine. Obviously, there is a little bit of tweaking here and there on occasion. Some wines look great and then just get better in barrel or tank. Some wines look terrific and then go the other way. And you need a little bit of that as a background. But basically, the selection is pretty much 90+% made at the bench during those classification tastings. And experientially, and this is part of the culture of Penfolds, people come through the ranks and get a feel for all of this over time. And these blends are put together by the Penfold winemaking team. It's not making wine by committee, it's drawing on the expertise of different specialists.
As somebody that has never blended a wine, the idea of having to sort of assemble from all these different samples a finished blend is something that I find absolutely daunting, actually. But I see your point that it comes through experience. And of course, you can only have one experience per year with the nature of the way that, you know, you're getting. So it takes a long, long time building it up through every vintage. Well, look, we better move on to the reds so that we've got plenty of time left for questions at the end.
Good, yeah. If I could just add to that blending thing though, Richard, just one little thing. You can't unscramble the egg. So once we've created the blends, we're superheroes. You know, you don't know whether you're right, wrong, or otherwise, it's done. So with very few exceptions, we put our blends together fairly quickly. The only exceptions to that would be our Pinot Noirs, where you don't really know what you've got till much, much later in barrique. And the Grenache variety in 138 is a fickle variety too. You don't know whether it's going that way or that way, but all of our blends are put together. For example, 389, the first one, this blend will be put together as quickly as possible after classification. And we've found that the blend gets better as a blend in barrel than the components will separately for these styles of wine. Now, what's the science of that? I don't actually know, but I do know that it works.
Yeah, well, it certainly does. The evidence is indisputable. This is looking particularly good, I think, at the moment. I tasted these a couple of hours ago when I was preparing, very conscientiously preparing all of the samples. And I think that 389 is one of the stars of the range. It just is such a classic Aussie style, that Cab Shiraz combination. And for those of you that are in Singapore, I'll just do a very brief plug because we are planning, that is the club, 67 Pall Mall, is planning a bin 389 vertical, which we are going to bring you as soon as we possibly can, in conjunction with Sam Stevens, who works with Penfolds here in Singapore. So keep your eyes open for that. It's going to be a fantastic tasting based on this evidence. You know, this is a really tremendous wine. And like I said, that Cabernet Shiraz combination is a real Australian invention.
It is indeed. You know, that blend, I guess, in Bordeaux, what we call the Bordelais blends of Cabernet, Petit Verdot, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, a magnificent Bordeaux blend. What's oftentimes described as the great Australian blend is of Cabernet and Syrah, Cabernet and Shiraz. This year, 2020, marks the 60th anniversary of the first release. So there have been 60 Bin 389s made consecutively. And understandably, it does benefit from the title of Baby Grange. You know, not only does it get relegated Shiraz out of Grange, not only does it get Grange barrels, we need more, of course, because we make more with 389, but it is made like Grange in that it's not just for the here and now. Great finishes of 389 look terrific 10, 20, 30 years later. And or you could drink this tonight, doesn't much matter. Again, that magic word choice. And people in Australia especially have been raised with this wine. You know, their parents drank it. There's a confidence with the style. There's no such thing as an ordinary 389. It's just that some are better than others. And I've noticed in the secondary market, you know, the 1990 389 recently has really shot up. The 76, the 86, there are some classic vintages. The pattern of the sixes with Penfolds is quite interesting. You know, here we're looking at 2016. I really did like the 2006, the 1996, the 86, the 76. There's something about the sixes. But people look a little bit too much into the numbers. And, you know, we used to have an advertising campaign, probably still do. Numbers can be extraordinary. People like to look at the bin numbers, like to look at all these patterns. And it's just another point of interest. But if we are looking at numbers, what you'll notice on the screen is that this is what, up the top, 51% Cabernet. It only just scraped in as being Cabernet predominant. That's what the style always is, Cabernet predominant, but that percentage can go up into the 80s, depending upon the year. Most in recent times, however, have been 50+%, you know, 55, 60 maybe, but usually in the 50s, but always Cabernet predominant, always matured in Quercus alba, American oak, usually, and you can see here, 37% new. It's usually around 30%, usually about 1 barrel in 3. And these barrels, unlike Gitana, are what we call hogsheads. They're 300-litre barrels, Barrique's being 225 litres. So it's a defined style. Again, no two are the same, but you can usually pick up a 389 and recognise what it is fairly quickly. And some people, even now, university students without much money, can still buy a case or two at 389 and go on the tasting journey with this style and not be disappointed when they get to the final one.
And you mentioned earlier when we were talking of the Gitana that the oak regime has changed over the years. What about with something like 389? Is there less new oak today than there would have been 20 years ago?
Pretty constant. We've been with this style, I don't know, we were quite lucky very early in the piece to hit that magic sweet spot, call it what you will, around 30, 35% new. Arithmetically, there are no two the same. They oscillate quite a bit, but it's usually in that range. One style that did change very provocatively was Bin 128, Coonawarra Shiraz. In the early 60s, late 60s, it was matured in American oak. And we found out very quickly that that Coonawarra Syrah Shiraz character better fitted the French oak regimen of maturation rather than American oak. And it was also a great way for us stylistically to separate 128 from 28. 28 in American oak, older, 128 in French oak, usually about 1 barrel and 4 new. Again, to separate the styles. But with Bin 389, no, Quercus alba worked day one. And the whole title, I guess, of Baby Grange, Grange is an American oak and it works. This also. A little bit later in the tasting, we'll taste RWT, which is a more contemporary alternative to Grange, all in French oak. So, you know, I often joke, we have our cake, we eat it, and we want a bit of the icing as well. We want it all. And as we have evolved the portfolio, we have been able to do lots of things. So it's not win or lose. It's not that or that. It can be that and that. And very lucky, you know, still to work for Penfolds with those choices.
And a comment from Michelle, who's joining us this evening, who says that she's been drinking the 389 for 30 years and it still impresses me. So, you know, that's as good as an endorsement as any. Right, let's move on to the St. Henri, shall we? And I just want to ask a question prompted by a few comments that you've made. I'll see if you can answer this with a simple yes, no. Will the word Syrah ever appear on a Penfolds label?
Not in my tenure. So I guess maybe one day, but no, look, it's a funny thing. We love Syrah. I buy and drink wines from the Rhone, California and elsewhere with that. And there are many great Syrah styles of wine made in Australia. They tend to be cooler climate styles, more savoury as a generalisation. There are many exceptions to that. But I think like with the variety Mourvedre, we call it Mataro. The variety Syrah in many parts of the world, we call it Shiraz. So we're quite proud to call it Shiraz. It is funny though, Richard, St. Henri as a style, you can see there Shiraz is used, but only up until a few years back, we actually called it St. Henri Claret. And people never even asked what variety was in it. It was just St. Henri Claret. And the history of St. Henri is quite compelling. We thought the history sort of began in the early 50s with the contemporary of Max Schubert, the creator of Grange, a senior Penfold winemaker, John Davrin, resurrecting the style of St. Henri that was created at a winery we bought down the road, Aldana, in the 1940s. So in the early 50s, he recreated a style that was originally established there. That style, St. Henri, going right back to the 1890s. So the style of St. Henri has basically not changed as a style, not since the early 1950s, but basically since the 1890s, which adds a whole new realm and layer, laminated going way, way back. It was a gentleman called Edmund Mesure who actually created the style at Aldana, and then we resurrected it Penfolds here at McGill, a few kilometres away in the 50s.
Somebody commenting there that they've got a, that's Raymond saying they've got a bottle of the 1986 St. Henri Claret, which you may well open as a lockdown wine. So if that adheres to the rules of 6, then that should be a brilliant, brilliant drink.
Lovely wine, and it doesn't need much of a decant. We double decant all of our reds, of course. The 86 St. Henri, give it 10, 15 minutes. That's all it needs prior to pouring.
Fantastic. When I tasted this earlier, I was very much reminded of Great Northern Rhone Syrah, which is, you know, no surprise really, because we've got the same variety, different climates, admittedly, but made to the same kind of quality standard where you've got this really beautiful, pure fruit, but loads of structure as well. And that's something that I find often is missing from the more modern styles of wine producers who want to make things which are gratifying immediately. And there's something really nice about tasting a wine which is really firm and structured and built to last.
And indeed, you know, and oftentimes nowadays in winemaking, if there's too little oak, you're criticised. If there's too much oak, you're criticised or whatever. But it's all about balance and integration of oak. But this provocatively, you've heard me say before, Richard, is the most old-fashioned style of Shiraz made in Australia. The technique of making it, maturing it, has not changed. Back to the 1800s. It's still matured in very large old foudre, very large old vats. So there are none of those oak-derived tannins, oak-derived flavours. This is just pure, unadulterated Shiraz fruit. Occasionally, and you can see there, a little bit of Cabernet in this vintage, 5% snuck in. In some of the very, very old St. Henri's, a little bit of Mataro snuck in. Not so in recent decades, but in some of the earlier ones. Some made here at McGill after Aldana from the quarry block which many people aren't even aware of. We had one bottle actually from the 1950s. We did our Rewards of Patience tastings not so long back for edition 8, and a collector from Hong Kong came in and shared a bottle of this Quarry Paddock Mataro that a little bit went into this in early days. So it's amazing what comes out of the woodwork. You know, at our recorking clinics, bottles are brought in that we haven't even read about or heard of. They're wonderful. You know, there's clinics that we've been running now for, decades. So you never quite know. But with Sononri, it is collected. There's an Australian ex-Federal Minister for Health who has a bottle of the 1896 that I'm trying to negotiate something with at the moment. You know, there's so much history with this wine, but it's a wine of contradiction as well. You know, a vintage that should be terrific, 1982, I don't think much of the 82 Sononri. A vintage that should not be very good at all, 1974, we refer to the 74 vintage as the Downy Mildew vintage. It was the wine of the vintage. You know, it doesn't follow the patterns of many of the other Penfold reds. But in recent times, not include the 16 amongst them, the 4 that have impressed me across the last half a century have been the 71, the 90, a bit like the 90 La Chapelle, 90 Char, beautiful universally, but 71, 90, the 2010, and now the 16. They'd be my 4 picks across the last half century for this style. And this one, although the deception of it again, drink it immediately, it's ready to be drunk, this will go at least 3 to 4 decades effortlessly if correctly cellared. But you look at it and you think, oh, it is ready now. But it will complex and enrich over time. And that has the track record, this wine Sononri.
Yeah, and that was my impression too. And you know, that's another reason that it reminded me of great Northern Rhone Syrahs. So we better just, sorry to quickly flip over that map, but I'm conscious that we don't want to run out of time and we should give the wines their due. So we're on to RWT, which is a 100% Shiraz, and also a single region wine.
Barossa Valley only, since day one. The term RWT originally stood for Red Winemaking Trial when we didn't have a name for it. And that's sort of stuck. If you notice, bin 798 has crept in recent times. It's earned its stripes. It's now a fully fledged bin member. Yes, constantly as part of its template, it must be matured in French oak. There's only ever been one vintage, 1998, that was stored in 100% new oak. Most are around this one here, 72%, usually around 70, 75% new oak, but always French oak, not barriques, but hogsheads. So always 100% Shiraz, always Barossa Valley, always matured in French oak barriques, but no two are the same. So it reflects very much what's going on in the Barossa in that particular year. One of my favourite RWTs is the 2002 vintage, which was a very, very cool year. Not the coldest on record, but almost. So a cool year in a warmer region. I think there's something to be said for that association. And it was so interesting because the year prior to that in the Barossa, 2001, was one of the hottest at the time on record. Not the hottest, but one of. In fact, in 2001, the Clarenvale had its highest mean January temperature since 1915. It was pretty warm. We've had warmer since, but at the time, it was very much there. So very warm in 01, very cool in 2002. And I think the RWT style does suit a cooler year out of the Barossa, usually. That's a rule of thumb, a generalization.
And am I right in thinking that the RWT, the trial part of that name, refers to the French oak?
Yes and no. Look, for many years, and I'll go back to grain sheathing. You know, there have been many, many people who said, "Oh, Grange, I like it. I love the style." But you know, my mindset is, "Oh, but I don't like blends and multi-regional blends." And American oak, it's not for me. So can't you tweak Grange? Can't you change Grange? You know, make it more contemporary. Well, why would we ever do that? It's not broken. And in fact, so many of the modern day Granges are so contemporary. Template's an old template, but the style I don't think is all that old fashioned. So rather than change Grange, we came up with RWT. Okay, with Grange multi-regional, here's a single region. With Grange, Quercus alba, or American oak, oh, here's a Syrah, here's a Shiraz in French oak. So it's not this or that, it's Grange and RWT. And then people have that choice of selecting between the two. So the trial part was never really a trial other than how do we tweak the oak, really what parts of the barossa do we want to use. And it had within the cellar a generic code for computer usage. And the insert bit was RWT, you know, you fed into your worksheets on the computer. So many, many marketing dollars later, oh, what's the name of our new wine? Oh, RWT. And we've lived at that for a long time. But
Yeah,
look,
well,
it is hard. I often laugh at names, you know, bin numbers even. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 wines, you know, Grange is a lovely name, Yatana, Sononri. But we like, you know, like naming children. You know, your first girl, your first boy, the second, the third. Imagine if you had 53 children. You know, you start to run out of names after a while. So bin numbers come in very handy as a demarcation of style and whatever. And with RWT, it was the best name at the time, but not an easy name.
No, but you know, and when these names have good stories and they have good origins, then they stick for good reason. So let's move on to a different variety altogether then. Here we are on Cabernet with bin 707. And this is a blend of different regions. We can see Coonawarra, McLaren Vale, Barossa Valley, Adelaide Hills. So actually all South Australia, and with lots of American oak.
Always by definition, Richard, always 100% new American oak. And people tend to think, and quite rightfully so, that a wine or a component or a parcel can't necessarily suit 100% new oak every year. Completely correct. So when that happens for contenders where the oak just dominates and is over the top, we relegate that parcel. It's not used in the blend. So we know straight away when we're selecting parcels at classification for 707, it chooses you. You don't choose the parcel and make the selection. You know, the oak is completely absorbed. The lovely barrel fermentation character that Grange also gets is there. And you don't even really think about the oak. You just think about this alternative, pure fruited, you know, expression of Cabernet. Now, 707, I only wish we had time and for another wine. Like with RWT and Grange, we now have a Cabernet that sits alongside 707. So there would be many people who, again, don't like the concept of a multi-regional blend or American oak. 169, bin 169, is single region Coonawarra, a wonderful region for Cabernet sourcing, the great winds, John Riddick's, those sorts of wines made down there. So single region Coonawarra and in French oak. So again, you know, 707 is its own animal. It just happens to be a Cabernet. It's 707 first, Cabernet second. Whereas bin 169 is classically Cabernet. This is something altogether different. This, you know, and it sounds a little bit glib, but this is our Grange of Cabernet. Mm-hmm. It doesn't conform to what a lot of people think of the variety. Having said that, though, I was just reading Drinks Business, and last week the Masters results came out. Many MWs were in the judging panel, and Cabernet is £50 and above. I think this came out on top. This actual vintage, the 16. The Swedish magazine Vitiskörda just recently awarded this wine 100 points, whatever that means. But I'll tell you because it's 100 points. But, you know, it does quite well. It's not classically what you would think to be regal, raw blood, blue blood Cabernet. It's 707. And many people like it. Despite its price, and the price is quite elevated, it sells out so quickly. So obviously we're doing something right. But at the same time, we're not arrogant to say, well, this is it. That's why we have a bin 169 as well. And people have that choice. Great. Now, it's not a machine gun approach, by the way, when I say this, and I use the word choice, it's not saying, oh, look, we'll cover every colour, every dot, every style, every price point. It's not that at all. Our portfolio has grown, but many wines have fallen by the wayside over the decades. The ones that remain like this, you know, since 1964, 389 since 1960, Grange since 1951, St Henri since 1953 for us, 1890 originally. So the ones that are still with us are the ones that are working.
And some lovely comments from those people who are tasting the 707s. People saying that the acidity is intense in a good way, and that the 707's really gone up in quality since the mid-2000s, and that they're very much enjoying it. But talking of Grange, we'd better spend a little time discussing this wine. Before we go over to the questions, we've got quite a few questions to put to you. But we've changed vintage. This is 2050.
Yep. Grange is always released last, I guess you could say. 4 to 5 years maturation in well, it's bottled obviously in this instance 20 months after it's put together in April, May, June of the year prior, and then having been in bottle and barrel rather for 20 months in some years, 18 months in other, it then has bottle maturation before release. And we learnt the hard way, Max Schubert, the creator of Grange in the early 50s, the first few Granges weren't all that well accepted. And I have a theory that he probably showed these wines to people too young, too early. It is a bit of a statement even, years later, 5 years later, but 5 months after bottling was probably when he was passing the bottles around and showing people. And the hidden Granges, 57, 58 and 59 bore a consequence to the family, their known company saying, well, stop the production. It was a completely misunderstood style. It was also a style alien to the styles of the time, stored in 100% new oak. But I'm sure he showed people these wines too young. Having said that, though, upon release, many people say, oh, those people over there, they don't understand wine. They're drinking this Grange in the year of release. How could they? Well, can I tell you very easily, this is very, very easy to drink in the year of release. It's just that many people, yourself included, and Ronan and myself, we've looked at these wines as 20-year-olds with some secondary characters. We've looked at these wines as 40 and 50-year-olds with tertiary characters. Those are evocative maturation characters that only come with age. And yes, this is nice. If you like primary fruit, if you love the vivacity of youth, drink it tonight. If you want those age maturation characters, drink it later. And I think this is Grange's claim to fame. At the Rewards of Patience tastings I mentioned earlier for edition 8, the star of the show, every single Grange, with the exception of 51 tasted, up until the not yet released 2016, the star of that tasting was the 1952. The first time ever, the 52, it's taken almost over 60 years to overtake the 53, which was my favorite. So, it's taken us all this time to see a 52 that looks better than a 53. What a lovely story. The 55 was the one that used to get all the accolades, and all three are terrific, and it's personal preference. But, isn't it lovely to say out of all of those wines lined up, the wine that shone on the day, not because of its curio effect or not because of its age, was the 52. Like the 1990 wine of the year, the 62, the 52 just stole the show. It was incredible. And that's what Grange does.
And it's one of the great joys of wine is that it can represent, a time in history. And any one of those wines by itself would be a fantastic experience. But when you do get to compare them and you can see the evolution, it's such a fascinating exercise. So look, I'm going to turn those slides off now and move over to the questions, because we've got about 5 minutes left and quite a few questions. So I'll try and get through as many as we can. There's a question from Adam Hutchinson, which he asked when we were talking about the Yatana, actually. So perhaps it refers specifically to that wine. And he says, Peter, you mentioned the wine is blended. How many components might typically make up the final wine?
Look, it depends upon the year. Sometimes we have a bevy of riches and we're very spoilt. All of the regions for Yatana sourcing are performing. In a year like this, though, for example, the Tumbarumba components haven't risen to the fore. Adelaide Hills, we have less to choose from, so we're more reliant this year on Tasmania and southern Victoria. So we might only have 20 or 30 contenders in a year like this. The same with Grange. In some years, you might only have 30 or 40 components. It really depends upon what regions perform in a given harvest at that level. But there's no magical number. It's not like 72 choices. It varies year to year. And a lot of the choices are limited by the assessments we make in the vineyard, firstly, but secondly, at the fermenter stage for reds and the barrel stage for whites. And you discard things either at fermentation level or not long after. They might not even make it onto the classification bench for that blend because you've already seen what's happened. So yeah, but the classification tasting done blind is the final arbiter, where it's all done transparently and honestly and blindly.
But it might involve certainly dozens, possibly even 100 different wines.
Probably not nowadays. In the early days, yeah, we didn't know where to start and end, and there were a lot more choices. Now we've refined a little bit, which saves you a lot of time. In the instance, say, of Grange, if I can use that choice as an example, by finishing the fermentation in barrel, that's a very laborious scenario. You know, you've got so much going on around you in harvest. The last thing you want to be messing about with are barrels at fermenters in the middle of everything going on. So you will only put things to barrel at that stage to finish ferment in the barrel if it's got a very good chance of making it. So, you know, the material can go left or right at that point. So you're making so many value judgments from the vineyard to the fermenter, to the barrel, to the maturation, to the classification bench. So you start off with many and then you might reduce down to only, you know, 20 or 30 at the final classification.
This question has just caught my eye from Adam Hutchinson. He says, I'm curious to know if Penfolds had trialled the use of wood vinegar and biochar in any of its vineyards or nurseries.
If anything could be trialled, bought, experimented with, we probably have. Whether we've continued with the experiment of the trial, I don't know. But look, we've tried just about everything, and nowadays, even with sunlight and you know, spraying vines and almost putting sunscreen onto them, garlic spray to scare off birds before netting, everything has been trialled. And the same with oaks. You know, even now with our barrels, we don't just say it's only off that producer, that cooper. For our French oak, we source from many different coopers. We've had very good luck in Australia though with 707 and Grange. We use, yes, exclusively the AP John cooperage in the Barossa Valley, Quercus alba, and that goes back a long way. And they have just, and that's another change earlier of what's happened in the last 20 years or so, just the refinement and selection of the oak. So every stage is about refinement, including oak. But no, trials of anything, we just have ongoing trials. They never ever stop.
And a more straightforward question, Julian Kirk says, tonight, as we are locked down and love Penfolds, we are opening 78 Grange. Could Peter advise on decanting time?
Yeah. Well, the 78 Grange and the 78 Grange. You know if you've got a really good 78 Grange that has never moved and been solid perfectly, because you'll take the cork out of that bottle, you'll pour it into the glass, the 78, and it's essence of blueberry. At that age, it still has primary fruit and it's blueberry. If you have one of those bottles in perfect condition, even at that stage, an hour and a half is more than you need. If you don't have as much of that overt blueberry fruit, it means the wine is perhaps a little bit more matured and a little bit more developed. And I wouldn't take the risk. I'd only go 20 to 30 minutes. You know, that's one of the things the wine, you know, canning too long prior to pouring. The worst case scenario nowadays is with a big glass just more swirling, and or the glass gets put to one side while you try another one, waiting for it to open up. But once it's got past that point of no return, and we often joke, you can't get it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It's irreversible. And the 78, no, I love the 78. You know, the 78 Grange is the only Grange with a cork. This is net, of course, and it goes 1978, and the 1978 wraps itself around the cork. So if you have a two-prong Arso cork remover have a close look at the 78 Grange, and in block letters, I'd like to reintroduce it. It's beautiful. 1978 wrapping itself around the cork. It's the only Grange, the 78. That question, by the way, wasn't staged. I don't know, gentlemen who asked.
Well, I only chose it because it's my vintage too. So obviously it was a fantastic year for all things.
Oh,
I haven't yet had the pleasure, but I believe some people think that I smell a lot of blueberries too, if you get me on a good day. One more question, I think, from Will Trossel, who says, at the Penfolds dinner at 67, you said that the Block 42 2004 was your favourite. He says he's tried it once since and it's still his favourite. So how do you think it's getting on now?
Well, I think I said at that luncheon at Berry Brothers, because I think we opened the 62 bin 68, if it's the same luncheon, which is probably one of the greatest wines Penfolds has ever made, an Australian red wine legend. But the 2004 Block 42 was one of those very special wines where it just sort of happened. If you look at the alcohol in that wine, it's actually 13.45%. It's massively concentrated and naturally 13.45%. All the stars align with that particular vintage, the 04. It is the vintage we selected to put into the Penfold Ampule. And the idea with the Penfold Ampules wasn't gimmickry or marketing prowess or whatever. We wanted to create a Penfold time capsule. We are hoping, you can only open the ampule with a tungsten scourer, but some of those ampules will be open in 300, 400, 500 years time from now. And I am sure if there's any wine in our armory that can go that distance, it will be Block 42. Now the 2004, 100% new oak. The question I asked, is it still looking all right? How's it going? I don't drink the 2004 Block 42 currently if I can get away with it, because it's almost raw still. The wine is so unevolved, if correctly cellared. The 1953, there was a 53 Grange Cabernet and a 53 Grange made. And as earlier mentioned, the 53 Grange has always been with the 52 and the 55 tussling the #1 placement in terms of the Grange's best I've ever made. 53 Grange Cabernet, good bottles, are almost still on the ascent. I think the 04 will have a longer life than the 53, and it should, because of bottling technology advances, vineyard prowess and whatever. But not to forget that Block 42, we think, is the world's oldest continuously producing Cabernet vineyard. So, you know, vines planted in the mid to late 1880s, the same vines in that 10-acre vineyard. 04, bottled under screw cap and under cork. And I'm not too sure, Richard, if you were at the Master of Wine Symposium in Bordeaux, the Forging Links Symposium a few years ago. We poured Block 42 there, the 2004. I was on a panel with the late Paul Contelier from Chateau Margaux, Paul Draper from Ridge, and Alvaro Palacios. Were allowed one wine each. We poured the Block 42 Cabernet, and I thought, what have we done? You know, I think MWs, you know what they're like. We thought we'll get them out of their comfort zone. They'll be expecting Shiraz, we'll pour Cabernet. They'll be expecting a blend, we'll pour a single vineyard wine. And I got to Bordeaux and I thought, hang on, I bought a Cabernet out of Barossa Valley to Bordeaux. People loved it. That's the 2004 Block 42. It is a legend. If you've got it in Magnum, don't drink it. Give me a phone call and we'll buy it back, please.
Well, there you go. On that note, we've exceeded the hour, so we're going to have to wrap things up. That was such a great tasting. Peter, it's always such a pleasure to get some time. You know, very often you are traveling around the world meeting people. Of course, that's off the agenda right now, but we know that you are choosing carefully with who you spend your online time with. So it's a great pleasure of ours that you were able to join us for this event. And I know that you're going to be doing a Grange focused tasting for 67 hosted by Ronan in the coming weeks. So that will be fantastic for anyone that's attending. Please do come along to that. Thank you very much to everybody who asked some questions and gave us feedback in the chat. Apologies that I wasn't able to get to all of your questions, but we covered so much in that session, not least 6 really tremendous wines, which I'm now going to enjoy getting to the bottom of, so to speak. So at that point, we're going to leave it. I'll just say very briefly, for those of you who are interested in more Australian Shiraz, or in fact Syrah this time, I'm going to be talking to Toby Beckers from McLaren Vale. Is a great grower and making some fantastic wines, which he does call Syrah on the label. That's going to be on Sunday night at the same time. So join me then if you can. If not, then check out the 67 Pall Mall website, where we've got all of the events listed, including Peter's next one with Ronan, focusing on Grange. So until then, I'll say thank you again so much, Peter, for joining us. That was really greatly appreciated. And we will say goodbye for now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Richard, it's been terrific. Much appreciated. Thank you.